Hello, and welcome to another episode of Coyotenomics. Today we're going to talk about the issue of homelessness that affects many of our communities, some of the causes, both in terms of how people become homeless and what keeps them from escaping homelessness, and then we're going to talk about various different solutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
We watched several videos in preparation for this. We watched a documentary.
Yeah, it was called Streets of Plenty by a film student in Vancouver. It was produced around 2012. And we also watched a few videos by Vice, documentaries, and PragerU that covered various aspects of the issues.
There's a PBS one.
Yeah, and we'll link those in the description below.
Yeah, and we'd love to hear if you have your own resources. Please comment with them below.
Absolutely. And so yeah, let's first of all go through a few of the causes of homelessness and how do people first get into it. Obviously, mental illness is a big part of it. People struggle with these things and puts them in a more vulnerable position, and they're more likely to end up in that scenario.
Yeah, mental illness can stop you from getting a job and often create distance between you and like the people that would support you.
Absolutely, and that's the thing. Isolation makes you more vulnerable, and oftentimes people with mental illness self-isolate. Or there's more of a tendency to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it absolutely feeds into the problem in a very predictable, easily understandable way. And
related to that is addiction. In the Streets of Plenty video, he said that he did not meet a single homeless person in the midst of his experiment that was not dealing with substance abuse problems.
Mm-hmm.
Again, like addiction stops people from accumulating wealth and sort of lowers your self-esteem in a lot of ways, and just
kind of messes with the rational brain and makes your time preferences very immediate. You're worried about feeling good today.
Yes,
and it very
absolutely.
much just messes with you and puts you in a position where you're less likely to appreciate the benefits that come from long-term hard work, and it's just a dangerous cycle.
Absolutely.
And then the more the classic reasons are things like just scarcity. There's not enough houses to go around oftentimes.
Housing is too expensive in certain cities.
Absolutely, and just general poverty is a reason why many people find themselves unable to afford housing. I know there's one video we watched where a young man traveled to San Francisco, and he was actually had very ambitious plans to become employed, but because San Francisco is so pricey, he immediately became homeless because he just couldn't afford it. And it wasn't anything to do with addiction or mental illness. He just found himself all of a sudden not able to afford any homes around him. And and also economic crisis. When
sort of the same thing.
Yeah, when there's a housing bubble and it crashes, people all of a sudden who had houses are just left without.
Yeah, also on an individual level, like for people living paycheck to paycheck, like a broken leg or something like that can just completely get you out of your situation.
Yeah, you can get evicted very quickly depending on where you're at. And just incentives in general. Some people just find it makes more sense for them to be homeless, given what the options are around them. It's the path of least resistance, and that really depends on the scenario, obviously, and the particular value structure of the individual. But that's going to play a role, absolutely, for some.
And related to that, just personal choice. Like some people, for whatever reason, don't mind it as much. Or
I remember as a school, we volunteered at the soup kitchen when I was very young, and I remember meeting a guy, and he was homeless by choice, and that kind of blew my mind, talking to him and how he just kind of liked a very simple life of not worrying about having possessions or things. He just lived on the street. He was a very reasonable, lovely person too. So
it was interesting to me speaking to people about homelessness that and I guess we all know this, but a lot of religions and spiritual practices idealize that. Like the Buddha was homeless, Jesus was homeless, Moses was homeless, and on some level we idealize homelessness as the ultimate self-sacrifice, unselfish way of living.
Yeah, it's like a simple life where you're connecting to the most important things and not just these material things around you.
And outside of organized religion as well, lots of New Age spiritualism
Absolutely.
idealizes the same things, not accumulating personal wealth, not owning things,
Yeah.
things like that.
Hippies who just go live in the woods and whatnot.
Hippies, yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Perfect.
And then on to the question of what keeps people in this cycle of dependency and homelessness. I guess top of the list would probably be addiction, depending on where we're at. I know in Vancouver, where Streets of Plenty took place, everyone seemed to be addicted to something, but there also is a very large problem of drugs in that area of Vancouver. So this might not be the case everywhere, but definitely there, addiction was a big part of the cycle of what keeps people in that environment. And yeah.
Absolutely. We have a lot of barriers of entry into the job market that prevent homeless people. Not very many business owners would say they want to hire a homeless person. It's difficult for homeless, like basics of job interview etiquette, like showing up in a nice suit with a fresh haircut and things like that. These are often obstacles that are difficult for homeless people. And if you show up and you smell and you have old clothes, it's hard to have a fair shake at it.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
also, just like the more time you spend outside of the job market, the harder it is to get a job. Employers will ask, why didn't you have a job for 2 years? And if you tell them you were homeless and addicted to crack, like, that's not going to reflect well on you. And that, again, creates a cycle that's a difficult hurdle for people to overcome trying to escape homelessness.
Absolutely, yeah. And then just the incentive structure. A lot of things that are more means tested, where people will, if they get a job, they'll be removed from other government assistance, so they find that it's more rational of a choice to just not get a job and stay on the path that they're on. A lot of just perverse incentive structures end up keeping people on this path of living on the street.
Again, lack of access to mental illness services, and often these things are means testing as well. So once you get up that first step and you're just slightly out of homelessness, all of a sudden the safety net drops out underneath you. You don't have free addiction counseling. You don't have like a free place to stay because you're making some small, meager amount of income, and it can often drag you right back in.
Yeah, and rather than encouraging people to make the small steps that they need to make to climb out of it, they're just encouraged to not make any action because it would pull them back 2 steps. It's very, often set up very poorly. And then moving right along to, we're going to solve the problem of homelessness now.
Yeah.
Tyson and I, so...
So we'll discuss several of the sort of classic solutions to homelessness, and then we'll talk about our own personal feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think fundamentally the most long-term solution to homelessness is solving the problem of why people are so addicted and caught in a cycle of, well, addiction. And I think Gabor Mate is a famous, psychologist and abuse counselor who works a lot in Vancouver as well. And he talks about how almost everyone who he encounters in his shelters has had a history of sexual abuse or other type of adverse early childhood exposure to some bad situation. And a lot of people have talked about this in the last 30 years of psychology, just exploring the degree to which all of these things are related to abuse. And I think the most fundamental solution to ending addiction, which causes homelessness in a large way, is treating kids better and not abusing them so much, trying to protect kids, trying to create safety nets for children who are seeking an escape from their situation. And yeah, because it's ultimately when you get someone who's on the street, who's had a lifetime of abuse, who's addicted to heroin, it's very hard to put them in a good direction. It's possible, but I think a more fundamental solution is just treating kids better.
Absolutely. In some places, I know California had a program like this, and Finland has recently adopted what's called a housing first policy, which is just that before you do anything else for homeless, the first program the government does is putting them in an apartment or some sort of housing. And in Finland, this has been very successful. Finland is the only country in the European Union that's been seeing a decline in their homelessness. And they've declined 30% since 2008, which is pretty good. Obviously, this exacerbates certain issues with incentive structures and things like that, but it's in some contexts it can be very successful.
Yeah, I guess, and we've yet to see how it'll play out exactly. There's always going to be a balance between offering assistance to people and not enabling them. I know in the US there's been a lot of classic examples in New York and San Francisco, for instance. There's the issue of rent controls, where when you put in place rent controls, which is a desire to help people afford their housing better, all that does is basically massively increase the cost of housing, and leaves people oftentimes even more homeless or just forced to pay massive costs for housing. So there's a limit, obviously. There's a point at which providing free housing would be making the problem worse, because you'd be incentivizing just free living.
Yeah.
And then there's a point at which we need to obviously provide assistance to people, and it seems like there's going to be a balancing act between those 2 points. So we need to help people and provide for them, but we can't just give them free stuff forever, because it might have a negative outcome. And it's a very tricky balancing act, it seems like.
I'll just add on that point as well that like the more traditional methods of combating homelessness are not revenue neutral either, and like your city probably spends an exorbitant amount of money on police resources, things like anti-homeless spikes and things like that. That is all cost that is being spent to solve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so perhaps ideally we would have no taxes or whatever, but we can look at spending the money we have more effectively than we're spending it.
Absolutely. Where the current solution is much more criminalizing homelessness. And at this point we can maybe talk about the concept of NIMBYism, which stands for not in my backyard.
Yes.
And this whole attitude of a lot of people see the problem of homelessness as something that's external to us. It's like this unsightly, disturbing thing that we pass by on the way to work. And that's the problem, is that we have to look at it. We don't want this in our city. We don't want it in our backyard. And often that's the problem, or that's the viewpoint, is that people will ship off homeless people to other cities, or they'll encourage them to leave. They'll put spikes on benches. They'll just generally make it like illegal to share food in public, or illegal to other things that are otherwise like illegal to sit down in public.
Loitering.
Things that are otherwise completely innocuous, normal things to do that ideally in a free society anyone could do.
Mm-hmm.
We've kind of moved towards this like incredibly, well, it seems dystopian, this view where we're going to make it so you can't exist outside if you don't have a home, where people will there's one lady in this the quick documentary we watched where she was on the list to get apartment. It was being built. She was going to live there, but she had nowhere to live, so she's on the street. And then if she's picked up and then thrown in jail, she loses her access to that free apartment, or that apartment she's going to get, because she's been in jail. It's like, are we trying to help the homeless, or are we just trying to like push the problem away to someone else and treat them as a parasite, essentially, which is a lot of the mindset that some people have.
That's like another important issue to discuss, is that like the prison system is often functioning as a floor on our housing market, and a lot of like we get bent out of shape about paying for people's housing, but when someone goes to prison, according to the documentary we watched, it costs $80,000 a year to support somebody in prison, and there are a lot of solutions that are cheaper than that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And
better for them as well as us.
Yeah,
so.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Cool. And there's a lot of people who view the whole act of even feeding the homeless as being creating perverse incentive structures. And it can be so tough to find a way to draw the line between not enabling them and helping them. And personally, that's why I promote the idea of more individual action by people. I think it can be very, very hard for a government to put in place a policy that addresses the individual needs and problems of people in a way that's not promoting or enabling them. And it's kind of like just doing surgery with a chainsaw, whereas when you allow individuals to act in their own capacity, it's much more of a scalpel incision, is the way I see it. So I think a big part of the solution is to promote a culture that views these people as, they're not parasites, they're not freeloaders, they're not scammers, they're often people who are struggling with addiction, mental illness, just complicated circumstances, and we need to try to, wherever possible, offer assistance. Like maybe that means trying to like befriend people in that scenario, offer if we allow them to like camp in our backyards, or maybe we try to fund parks where they can go and stay, or fund public housing, whatever it happens to be. I think we need to promote a culture where we're actually trying to help people, but at the same time, I think we also need the option of not helping them, because sometimes it can derail into enabling. And I think the individual has the best perspective, and because they're closest to the scenario, they have the best insight to know at what point it becomes enabling and at what point they want to cut off assistance. So that's why I promote more of a individualistic approach or a charity approach, and not a government approach.
I'm not wholly opposed. I guess to really crystallize my views, I would encourage all of us to treat the homeless people in your community as if they're a part of your community. And in the same way that you would with a friend or a neighbor, like think of them as part of your world, treat them like a human being, talk to them, and just generally like we need to feel a sense of responsibility to help these people, or else they won't be helped. Like,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think one of the points that you've been making recently is that in our modern world, almost all property is owned.
Yes.
So we're not in a scenario where people can just kind of wander to the edges of town and set up shop and make a shack. And I think we need to be sympathetic to that and try to create spaces for them to go, or if they're forced to set up shop under a freeway or in a park, to be sympathetic to that and realize that we don't live in the old west where they can just like homestead.
In a urban city, and we didn't live in a small city, but I'm sure it's just as true in a big city, every effort by homeless people to meet their basic needs is seen as a problem. Like building a shack to keep yourself dry is a problem. Going through a garbage can to find food is a problem. Like picking out empties to get some money is a problem. And we just like anything that they do is to meet their basic survival needs is just seen as problematic unless it's specifically being provided for them. And they are not given opportunities to provide for themselves, which is like a big part of dragging somebody out of poverty. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Just allowing them to make the little steps, often very small steps, but that's all they can do to slowly make their way out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think giving them opportunities to accumulate wealth. Like often police do not protect the property rights of the homeless, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And police have very little interest in helping a homeless person who's been stolen from or things like that. And just generally like giving people the tools to build something, build a shack with a bed, and like slowly like work your way up to a house like people did for thousands of years. Like let yourself like accumulate food and start to save for a rainy day, as opposed to just like whatever you can hold in your arms at night because it's a free-for-all once the lights go out. Like allowing homeless people to participate in society and drag themselves up rather than seeing them as a charity case for us to solve on our own terms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know some people will promote the idea of helping all homeless people who are in need of assistance, and if they need housing, it should be automatically afforded to them, maybe by government mandate. And the reason why I think that that's not a good idea, or why I think the alternative is functional, I guess I should say this. People will point out that by my method of individual action and more of a charity-based approach, there will be some individuals who might not be helped still. And my take is, if there is like 1 million people in a city, or 1,000 different organizations and 100 different churches, and none of them are willing to help somebody because that individual has shown themselves to be kind of predatory or disingenuous, or they're being enabled in some unhealthy, destructive way by the assistance. If literally nobody in an area is willing to help them, then maybe it's best that they have a right to prevent that person from receiving funding. That's kind of my take on it, but it might seem a little bit socially Darwinistic, but that's kind of where I've landed, and that's kind of
I think to push back against that perspective a little bit, we've talked about how mental illness is one of the main causes of homelessness, and one of the big things that mental illness does is makes people unpalatable to society. And a lot of mentally ill people become homeless because their families stop putting them up, their friends get tired of them, and they aren't able to maintain a safety net because they have schizophrenia or something like that.
That's a very good point, yeah.
And without like government services that are essentially forced to deal with them, often they aren't able to charm their way into those services themselves.
And I guess I would diverge at that point.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think that mental illness can be another factor in the whole scenario, and I would promote a society that's compassionate towards that, and we would obviously try to take people off the streets if they're schizophrenic and try to put them in scenarios where they can have access to medication and assistance and mental health facilities and all of that. I still do believe though that if there's a bunch of like religious organizations in a city, I'd be very surprised if every one of them refused to take in or assist like a schizophrenic person. I generally think we're more compassionate than that, and I would say if society as a whole is so uncompassionate that nobody would take in this person, I'm skeptical that a government agency would somehow be removed from that attitude and be much more compassionate. I would say that generally governments are an expression of the values of the people.
Yeah.
And yeah, if we're really that cold that nobody's willing to help them, I'm not sure a coercive monopoly will change that in any meaningful way, but
that's fair enough. I would also advocate for individual solutions, but I would push to more of an idea of individual responsibility. The same way we don't, if you have a brother who's mentally ill or something and he's an asshole, like you still care about him and still try to help him. Perhaps help in some contexts means tough love. Perhaps help in some contexts means like institutionalization. It could mean all sorts of things. But for us to generally bear a feeling of responsibility towards the homeless and feel obligated to help. I think
that's a key point, is how we frame things is important.
Yes.
Like we could be the same action of not assisting someone financially, but if it's framed in terms of we need to give them tough love to provide the proper incentives to help them help themselves rather than not our problem, social parasite, outside of my world. I think there's very different attitudes, and I think one is much more healthy than that too.
Absolutely. Like, again, like individuals make individual decisions, and just as nobody would judge the way you dealt with an addict in your close circle, nobody should judge the way you feel about an addict in your community, but try to treat them the same way. Try to feel the same compassion for a stranger that you would for a loved one.
Absolutely.
And I think, just basically treating homeless people like people.
Yeah, I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because there's a lot of polarity in our society where some people just are so against the idea of homelessness or so unsympathetic, and a lot of people who I think maybe go too far in the direction of we just need to provide blanket government assistance, but we need to just kind of have more of a dialogue and see that we're all just people with a variety of circumstances, and so let's just try to come together a little bit. Maybe.
Absolutely. I guess in my personal life, I was on the verge of homelessness for a period of my life, and I was lucky enough that I had a safety net to support me, and I had couches I could sleep on and people who helped me out, and I had a job that I was able to maintain despite going without a shower every once in a while and things like that. And I would just put to everyone that you never know, and I know it sounds cliche, but you never know how far you are from homelessness.
Yeah.
An emergency, a broken leg to a lot of people would mean losing your job, losing your housing situation, a trip to the hospital, dealing with an illness. There's a lot of things that can happen to you that just completely uproot your life. And, to not always try to avoid taking the position that homeless people must have done something wrong.
Yeah, it was purely their fault.
Yes.
They therefore deserve whatever's coming to them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to the importance of friends and family and just social networks, because you had obviously demonstrated that you weren't a predatory person. You have people in your life that you were able to find a place to fall where you didn't hit rock bottom, and
absolutely
you ended up finding a more functional arrangement.
Yeah.
So I think that's a society working.
Yeah. Any final thoughts?
Burn the homeless. No. Burn them all. My final thoughts is that I think the most important long-term solution is we need to try to approach parenting with more compassion. We need to parent peacefully and respectfully, and we need to see things like spanking and sexual abuse as the incredibly insidious force that they are. They don't just abuse a child, they abuse the adult they will become and all the people in the society that that adult meets. It's like a ripple effect, and it all starts with the childhood. So I think that's the core of the solution. Obviously there's many ways of helping the problem when it's further along, but that's the core.
Absolutely. Homelessness is at a nexus of a lot of problems in our society. Problems with policing, problems with the economy, problems with parenting, problems with substances, and all sort of the worst aspects of all of those systems culminate in homelessness, which is unfortunate.
Indeed.
My final thoughts would just be to say again that, no man is an island. Homeless people are part of your community, whether you feel that way or not, and to treat them as human beings and how you'd like to be treated in their situation.
Very nice.
Yeah. Catch coyotes next time.